Hello, I'd like to continue this lecture. Basically, where we left off in the last lecture, we were looking at the movement of civilization out of the Middle East, Egypt, down into the Mediterranean, the sort of the magnet pull of the major civilizations on groups in the Mediterranean that could provide resources for the wealthier city-states, empires that were developing in that part of the world. And so we're moving back a little bit to the year 1200 as a point of departure for these events. And if you recall, when we were talking about Greece, we saw 1200 to 800 as something of a dark ages, which is a period in which other Greek-speaking groups will arrive on what will become the Greek peninsula and will replace the Macedonians, who had been the first Greek speakers to arrive in that region around the year 2000, 1900 BC, had spread into different islands in the Aegean, had ultimately replaced the Minoans, had gotten into commerce and trade, had developed systems with kings as the sort of political system of the individual city-states that were relatively independent but warring and back and forth. And we have the image of the Trojan War that Homer in the Iliad and also in the Odyssey as well will pick up on. So around the year 1200, this is a period of time in which there's a great deal of movement and migration of peoples in and around the Mediterranean region, and will sort of eat away at the edges of the power structures of the major empires at the time, from the Assyrian through the Persian Empire. These, what the textbook will refer to as borderland communities, communities on the edges of the powers to be at that particular point in time, create an interesting dynamic, if you will, historically, because these are kind of like marginalized cities on the outskirts, groups of people on the outskirts that will begin to eat away at the powers to be that control things and have controlled things up to this time, and create, if you will, a sort of an insecurity that hadn't been there before, with the powerful emperors and things in place and armies and control being exercised either by the Assyrian Empire or by the Persian Empire, as we've seen. And now these newer groups are sort of like free to explore, free to move about. They're not constrained by the powers of the overarching empire, which tries to control them and feed off of them and things like that, right? And so they're gradually becoming freed during this period of time from the control of both the Assyrian and the Persian empires, and begin to develop along the margins as borderland communities that are now free to explore new cultural ideas, engage in either religious or philosophical systems or things like that, or to create social and political organizations that are also new and experimental, and that reflect the sort of the lack of an overarching controlling system that can impose its will on them. And they begin to formulate, both in practice and in theory, new ways of organizing society and the relation of individuals within society. These are, for the most part, seaborne peoples, people who will use the Mediterranean as a springboard to commerce and trade, and through commerce and trade create systems of communication, connections with other people, and so goods and commodities are being traded, but also ideas are being traded. And along with ideas will be new inventions. One thing would be the alphabet, right? Coming out of the Phoenicians, the group along the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean, what today is Palestine and Israel. In that particular area, the Phoenicians then are there and engage in trade with Cyprus and other parts of the Mediterranean, will eventually send out the group that establishes the city of Carthage in North Africa, in what today is Libya. No, in what today is, well, Morocco. Okay, it'll come back to me later. What can I say? C'est la vie. In any case, so we have these seaborne people, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Etruscans. So the Greeks, as you would see, again on page 192, there's a map with an interesting overlay of the Mediterranean and all of the different groups that are spread all around the Mediterranean. And you can see how the Greeks will go up and surround the Black Sea area. There are these various groups there. The Etruscans are going to be the group on the Italian peninsula that will control commerce and trade with the outside world, will engage in a lot of that trade themselves, will suppress groups like the Romans that are underneath them, underneath their power, until finally the Etruscans get broken by others. But that's a different story for a different day. And there are other groups involved in this movement of population and establishing a new form of city-state. Let me see. At the same time, there are going to be improvements in maritime technology. And after all, these are groups that are going to be engaging in commerce and trade on the Mediterranean. To do that, you need good ships. You need to be able to steer and, guide yourself and things like that. And so there are new systems of maritime technology that are developing that help places like, say, Athens become a major emporium for import and export, transporting and other kinds of things, right? After the year 800, we've certainly seen this already when we spoke about the Greek city-states, that after the year 800, we begin to see a resurgence. You get the emergence of a new form of the city-state. We saw the city-state in Mesopotamia, specifically in the Sumerian regions all the way to the south in Mesopotamia. And those city-states, as we saw, were urban centers, centered themselves around a religious structure that will morph over time into a ziggurat, become a ziggurat. But that's several hundred years into the process. But temples at the start are the sort of the building block for those cities that get built around them. But around them is an area of land controlled by that same city-state that is the source of food for that food-dependent population, those specialists, the priests and others that are the first specialist of civilization, scribes and others who are there and who rely on food shipments from the surrounding fields back into the city. That earlier system was the first city-states to emerge on the planet, if you will. The Greeks then, and others in this region who are engaging in this, right, like the Phoenicians, who will send out colonials and form colonies and city-states around North Africa and other parts of areas onto Spanish soil. The Greeks then will transfer around to different areas. These city-states show sort of a relatively new form of organization because they are truly governed by their citizens, right? There is a degree of self-government and indeed a movement towards democracy, which exists in a number of different areas, is more pronounced in Greece, where democracy is sort of self-aware, so that Athenians see themselves as being distinctive from other groups because they are truly democratic. We wouldn't call them a true democracy because women and a lot of other people in the city don't get to participate in it. But that 1/4% of the population that truly participates in Athens do really participate, right? So they become self-governing city-states where citizens have a role to play. They are a new political form of organization, social organization, that will profoundly influence the Mediterranean region because of the spread of city-states all the way around. Now, one of the interesting things, when you look at the map on page 192, you'll certainly see this, is that it's almost like frosting on a cake, right? The settlement by Greeks, by the Phoenicians, and by other groups, and less so the Etruscans who do penetrate the interior, is much more a phenomena of settling along the coasts of different areas. In other words, the city-state that is established on the coast is designed to be a port of trade, to exchange materials with other parts of the Mediterranean, right? Oops, chill. It's supposed to get cold tonight. Okay, so in effect, these are ordinary resident citizens who govern themselves, select their leaders, and it takes various forms. The book outlines for us 3 forms where you have a single leader, which in Greek gives us the origin of the word tyrant, but in the Greek form, it was a person who was selected to rule for a year by the people, right? But since you have a single leader there, then you have the oligarchy, the oligoi, ruled by a small number of wealthy and powerful citizens. And so it's a bit more inclusive in terms of the government than the single one, but still it represents the overriding influence of the wealthier and more powerful people. And finally, democracy itself, which is considered to be the most inclusive, that opens up governance and participation in government to a much larger slice of the total population, right? And so these new cities create, if you will, new communities of adult male citizens. They are the dominant figures in them. There will be other people living there as well. Women, for example. Women are, for the most part, considered to be, I wouldn't call them second-class citizens. They are not truly citizens in the sense of having the rights of citizens and the right to participate in government and influence government and vote or whatever you want to define a citizen on. But they do have certain rights and are respected and this kind of a thing. But the assumption is that a woman's place is in the home, right? And this is more or less dominant throughout the region. The only one exception to this, which is kind of interesting, is Sparta. We will look at Sparta a little bit later, but let's just mention in passing that since Sparta was unique and uniquely different from the other city-states, in that Sparta was a militarized state. And it's a militarized state because the ancestors of the Spartans came in and conquered a people who were, let's see if I can, conquered a people who were in the region when they arrived and converted them into slaves. And so the Spartan way of life evolved out of this act of conquest and enslavement because they didn't enslave and sell them. They kept them almost like serfs on the land. They don't belong to individuals, they belong to the state of Sparta itself, right? And a Spartan, a true Spartan, who is a citizen and member of the Spartan society, has one obligation: to become a member of the military and hence ensure through military service, through warfare, through their sort of expertise in warcraft, to ensure that there will never be another, because there had been one, uprising of the serfs against them, because the people that they have enslaved are sort of like relatives. They're Greek speakers who happen to be there and get conquered and then forced to work for the Spartans. And so it's a unique way of life. Ultimately, as this system evolves, the Spartans themselves will go off to war. The men go off to war. It's what they do. The women stay behind and run society in the absence of the men. And so women have a great deal more freedom there. They can own land, they can own businesses, as opposed to a place like Athens that's considered the birthplace of modern democracy. Yet on the other hand, women were treated, like I said, like third-class kinds of citizens whose job was to stay at home, go out fully clothed, almost like you see in a place like Saudi Arabia, where I lived for 5 years, right? Even though that's changing somewhat, it is changing rather slowly. Still, there is resistance there to the freeing of women from the burqa and all the things that they have to wear, and before they go out and dress, right? So the family, which is, if you will, the dominant form of social organization here, aside from the state itself, is a family with male dominance, some of which we've seen in the Code of Hammurabi, but this is now cultural male dominance embedded into the structure, and women's place is in the home, except in a place like Sparta that is different and unusual for special reasons, right? Okay, so it's looking at it from space down, like like we're in a big balloon over the Mediterranean, looking down at it. There is an absence of a centralized power to impose the law and order and a system in place. So, in the absence of a centralized government to control residents and their acts or their thoughts, city-states become very competitive places. There were violent rivalries between individuals. Think of something like a Romeo and Juliet scene. The Capulets and who was the other ones? I haven't read that in years, right? But the competing families there, right? Sort of mirror what was going on in the city-states over there, where different families are competing for commercial control and political control to the extent that you could. So there are violent rivalries between individuals, between social classes, other groups, right? And in this environment, there grows a sense of competition for honor and prestige, something that we're going to see carrying over into Rome in a certain sense as Rome begins to grow and develop. But it will be vested entirely in the military. Um, Here we see this competition for honor and prestige becoming a value that can shape the behavior of individuals in city-states, and we can see it morphing into organized systems of competition, which is to say sporting events. We have then in the year 776, which is just about the time that Homer is writing the Iliad and the Odyssey. We have the emergence of the Olympic Games in the southeast zone of Greece around Olympia. And that then becomes one of the ways in which this pent up competition between individuals can be manifested. In the original Olympic Games, there was only one winner. Everyone else was a loser, right? If you came in second, it didn't make any difference at all, right? There were no silver medals. There were no bronze medals, right? Nothing like that. There were winners and everyone else were losers, right? And so the level of competition was ferocious, right? But it also, sport in that regard was almost preparation for armed conflict, for warfare. And you have in the book that marvelous picture of the ceramic with the soldiers armed with the hoplites carrying their big shields with their spears. And it's serious stuff, right? Their form of warfare puts the onus on the ability of the individual on the field of battle to defend himself and his fellows, because they would form what was called a phalanx, which is a unified group of soldiers that are sort of like put their shields together and were able to hold the shields in front of them with one hand, while underneath they had those relatively long spears that they could sort of fight that way. The sense of warfare. What is that word? Oh yes. Okay. The one war specifically in this part of the world at this point in time, when we get to the Romans, we'll see some other stuff, is something called the Peloponnesian War. Now, in the last class, I think we took it to about 499, at which point the Greek city-states had begun to sort of rebel against the weight of the Persian Empire, and we have a series of Persian wars, which are all fought on Greek soil, but ultimately lead to Greek victories to the extent that the Greeks are able to resist and drive the Persians back out. They don't move in any sense to take over areas that belong to Persia, but they are able to defend themselves against it. And in the aftermath of the Persian Wars, Athens and Sparta, together with other smaller city-states, will form something called the Delian League, which is kind of like a mutual self-defense agreement. If I get attacked by a third party, you have a sort of a moral, political obligation to come to my defense, much in the same way as we have in the NATO agreement following World War II, where the United States and European nations agreed to a mutual defense system that should the Soviet Union invade any of those countries, the United States pledged to join in with other members of NATO to defend against that. And that system is still in place today, albeit with a certain amount of political resistance. We don't want to get into that right now. Okay, so we were looking at Athens and Sparta. Eventually, over time, Athens will come out of the Persian Wars as the sort of wealthiest of the different city states and begins to use the Delian League as a way to raise taxes on some of the outlying areas, claiming that, well, we're defending you, you should pay us, right? And eventually, this will lead to an outbreak of violence between Sparta and Athens, which then becomes, if you will, the Peloponnesian War, which will last from 443 BC, 431 BCE to 404. So that's 27 years, something like that, like something like 27 years. And it's one of these, there'll be a war here and people are killed and they back off and they reestablish and come back out again and a new conflict emerges and flares up and fighting flares up. Now, these are two rather different cities that are confronting each other here. Athens is a coastal city, like most of them are, as I mentioned. Most of this kind of colonization and movement to establish new city states occurs along the coast because they're all part of a sort of an interconnected commercial grid, if you will. And when they go out to establish colonies, there's two basic components here, two things they have in mind. The first is to make contact with people having resources that are valuable in the larger sphere of the economy in the Mediterranean region and beyond into Egypt and Mesopotamia. So they're looking for resources. Say, for example, up in the region of the north of the Black Sea. Well, that particular area has a lot of pine forests. And pine resin was an extremely valuable commodity, if you will, for all of these maritime places because they used the pine to seal. They'd put one plank of wood over another one, okay, and you had to then, let me see, maybe if I'm not looking at the screen, which always does me in, okay, so they put one plank of wood over another, and to seal, along the bottom. See the bottom of my hand. Okay. I don't think I'll ever learn how to do this because, you look at the mirror and there's one way, and you see yourself in this, and it seems to be opposite. And so I see a hair flying in the air, and I reach up and I go, that's the wrong hand. It's on this side, right? In any case, you don't need to know that, right? That's my own issues and problems here with this. So the Black Sea, they're settling there. That's one thing. There's also honey that they can collect out there because honey is extremely valuable. Can be collected, and sold in small packages, and you can make good money on it. This kind of a thing. And so they're moving around looking for areas that have, in the interior, resources that they can use. Athens is a coastal city that grows and becomes probably of the Greek city-states, the largest, certainly the largest, the wealthiest, if not the most powerful. Maybe Sparta, maybe because it is totally dedicated to warfare, but the most powerful in terms of its navy, right? It has a very strong navy to go along with its maritime pursuits. Sparta, on the other hand, is an interior city that I mentioned already that is dedicated to agriculture, but they don't do the work themselves. They've got slaves that do it. They are dedicated to warfare, right? So they're a very, very different society. There are two societies moving in different directions. Athens, of course, as we know today, is the sort of most um, sophisticated, um, cosmopolitan of the different cities. It has um, colonies, groups of people, merchants who come there from Egypt and Mesopotamia and places like that, right? That have established, different neighborhoods where you have this group and that group and this kind of thing. And so it's sort of like a New York City kind of a place where you can go to New York City and you've got all these different surrounding neighborhoods with you've got Colombians here and you've got Polish people settled here and you've got Chinatown over here and it's kind of like that Fort's time, much smaller than New York, but large in terms of that particular period, right? Anyway, these two go at it to fight for control and dominance of the Greek city-states and perhaps of an emerging Greek empire in the region, something like that. It will lead then, as it's it, the end result of the Peloponnesian War then will be Sparta wins, but Sparta prevents some of their allies who have, suffered at the hands of the Athenians from going into Athens and destroying Athens and this kind of a thing, because of the help that the Athenians gave them and the other Greek city-states to indeed defeat the Persian armies when they were there. And so they do protect them. But both Sparta and Athens have suffered immensely, and indeed the Greek city-states at the end of this war are sort of have been knocked down a notch in terms of their, they were on an upward trajectory, and this particular war really sort of knocked them back quite a ways, and they will never recover to the same level that they had been at, right? Okay, so let's see. Now, the area itself is going to be dominated by market economies with free markets and money-based economies. They will start producing coins, and a variety of coins will appear that are accepted in the markets throughout the region. They will develop inside the cities themselves open trading markets, as well as this system of money, which enables them to be able to assign a precise value in terms of the monetary systems of the commodities that are for sale in the market, which will create systems of exchange that are much more efficient. In the Greek city-states, they have something called agora. The agora, and the agora is the Greek term for the marketplace that is found in virtually all of these city-states, and that sits in a central location in the town. It's an area where individuals go, set up booths and other kinds of things, right? And you can buy and sell commodities. Herodotus, who traveled around and visited Egypt and Babylonia, said these particular agoras are unique to the Greek city-states. They're not found in Egypt and Babylon. Now, trade and colonization, which are part and parcel of this way of life that has been brought in by these new groups moving around the Mediterranean, will carry this way of life throughout the Mediterranean, up to the Black Sea, parts of Spain, North Africa, Italy, as we've seen Greece. Um, all of these areas then are going to be influenced by the growing presence of these maritime groups who are engaging in commerce and trade and exchanging commodities and ideas, inventions, and other things, right? Um, One of the things that emerges at this time as, shall we say, a new phenomena, relatively speaking, not entirely new, but a new phenomena, which is what the textbook refers to as chattel slavery, where indeed uh, a human being can be reduced to a commodity in a marketplace, can be bought and sold. And since these are societies in which, in effect, everything is being bought and sold, and the city itself is built around a central marketplace, it might make sense that if everything can be sold, well, people can be sold, right? In Athens, for example, a city that was considered to be the birthplace of democracy, 1/4 of its total populations were slaves, give or take, right? Um, we have the same issue in this country where, you know, uh, we take this truth to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Well, maybe not so, right? If they've been captured and sold as slaves and they're owned by other people, they're not equal under the law, right? They have special status under the law. They're considered property and they're covered by property rights, right? Nevertheless, with all of this as background, then, we have to admit that this is a period of time in which new ideas begin to percolate up, perhaps because there isn't that um, oppressive control by an all-powerful individual at the top of a political bureaucracy that imposes its will, that claims to be receiving laws from the mouth of God or the gods themselves, right? And so, in these new areas, individuals can indeed begin to debate and discuss what the laws should be, what indeed governance should be, right? And so the textbook suggests that in this realm of new ideas, we begin to get naturalistic sciences emerging together with realistic art. And I do like the fact that the textbook puts in this realistic art aspect here, because, given the magnificent, for example, magnificence of the Greek art in so many different areas, particularly in the portrayal of the human body. Marble sculptures that are still, go to the Louvre, and there's Winged Victory at the top of the steps, magnificent statue stolen from Greece, brought there. We don't want to get into that, right? These kinds of things, right? Or you go to Athens and go to the Acropolis, and you go to the museum inside there, and there are marvelous pieces of representational art there that are, less like the art that we would have seen with the Persians, which were designed for political purposes to magnify the power and the glory of the ruler and to show his connection to the divine realm, things like that, right? We would have seen that in Syrian art as well. The Assyrians had very, very similar art, and that art will influence the Persians because remember, Persians had been sort of nomadic peoples who came to power and didn't have a tradition of monumental art and relied on the Assyrians. So we get a realistic art that began to represent the world in natural ways as you would see it with your eyes, right? And indeed, after the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and Europe will end will end up in its own dark ages. Ultimately, when Europe comes out and you have that Renaissance period in Europe again, the Renaissance, that rebirth is actually a rebirth of the classical tradition of portrayal of naturalistic art, which will be taken up again. And think of, for example, Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, right? These incredible artists who, carry that tradition of naturalistic art even further with their skillful portrayals, right? Well, at this point in time, this begins to make its appearance in a variety of forms in the circum-Mediterranean, right? And even with the movement of art out of Greece to other places. Okay. We also get new thinking, new forms of thinking. And here in particular, we are looking at the emergence of Greek philosophy, right? And so the early Greek thinkers, the so-called cosmologists, right, began to explain natural phenomena in a new way. So before this, there had been a reliance on divine forces, the gods intervening in the realm of man, creating earthquakes, creating storms, creating things, intervening on the battlefield in a variety of ways, right? Now suddenly people begin to try to explain natural phenomena in natural terms. Now, some of their explanations today might seem childish and bizarre, right? But again, they are looking at ways of explaining how things occur, what's going on, what an earthquake is, why does the earth shake, right? Well, they come up with some bizarre explanations that the earth is, I can't even remember, sitting on the back of a turtle and the turtle move, something really bizarre and strange. But they're looking for sort of physical modalities, natural phenomena explained in natural terms by looking at natural forces that may have had it, and they begin that process. They move away from gods and supernatural forces intervening to explain events and move in a direction that is sort of closer to our sensibility that you need to explain the physical world in terms of forces and processes in the physical world. At the same time, though, they went beyond this because they also began to develop systems of logical thinking and applying logic to their analyses. And if you're going to apply logic, then you may take it a step further and begin to apply mathematics at the same time. So they're moving in the direction of sort of modern science, in that modern science uses mathematics as the sort of language par excellence of modern day science and scientific explanations, right? Okay, this will lead to a point in time in the 5th century, the 400s, where philosophers philosophers moved away from sort of trying to explain natural phenomena towards trying to explain human nature, human society, humans and their place in society, right? And certainly the first truly significant figure here is a person that you've probably heard, the figure of Socrates. And there is a picture of the statue of Socrates, the white marble carving of Socrates. And Socrates was reputedly the ugliest man in Athens. was probably the type of person that you wouldn't really want to have as a neighbor, because he would constantly, ask you something. You'd answer and they go, well, what about this? And then what about that? The so-called Socratic method of forcing you to reconsider what you think you know by challenging it and challenging the assumptions upon which your statements were based. Um, I try and use this in class a bit, but I'm not Socrates, and students today are not often ready for that level of confrontation and give and take. Uh, and when my classes work, I can do it. But some students rebel, and you never know what's going to happen, right? Okay, so Socrates is going to build a system of philosophy that is based on reflection and self-reflection. It's based on the pursuit of ethics and morality in the life of the individual. What is the good life, right? And effectively, he answers that question, what is the good life, by saying the unexamined life is not worth living, which is to say that, um, we are all influenced because we come out as totally dependent and defenseless infants, learn language and ideas from our family and interaction with family and members of the community, and are taught how to behave and possibly told what we should become in life, right? Certainly, if you're a woman growing up in Athens, you're being told to, get ready to get married and start making babies, and that's your fulfillment in life. We see where that is today, that mentality is today, even though it is being challenged in parts of the world. There are parts of the world that see that idea that a woman can indeed do everything a man can do, right? And it's being challenged by people who want to reestablish male dominance in society, right? In any case, the unexamined life is not worth living is a challenge to you, not to simply accept the life that you've been given, but you must, in effect, analyze and choose your own life for yourself, right? Effectively, as I said, I'm not sure I'd want him living next to me. He described himself as a gadfly. And a gadfly is a fly that lands on the butt of a horse and is constantly biting the horse, and getting the horse angry, right? Because there's this thing, and he slaps his tail, and the flies around and comes back down and bites him again. Eventually, let's face it, he pisses off enough people in Athens, enough important people in Athens, to be brought to trial, to be put on trial for the charge of corrupting the youth, other things, worshiping other gods and things like that, right? But he will defend himself, and he describes the need for honor and integrity as opposed to pursuing wealth and power, that the good life, the life of self-reflection, is dedicated ultimately to a life of honor, integrity, rather than wealth and power. And he is convicted in the trial, and sort of convicted to a death sentence, which he must do himself. He will take poison and kill himself, even while his students were begging him to not do it, to go abroad, because Athens would have let him go into exile. His student, one of his students, but his most important and famous students, is Plato. And the only reason we really know Socrates and really know him, he's mentioned by another author, but it is Plato who uses Socrates as his mouthpiece. Now, Aristotle has warned us, Aristotle, the third major figure here, has warned us that be careful. Plato has put his ideas into the mouth of Socrates, and you cannot entirely be sure that that's what Socrates was saying if Plato has him saying it in um, one of his dialogues, which are like little plays where Socrates will walk around and meet a group of people, and there'll be some students and other people there, and they'll engage in conversation, and he will, exhibit his Socratic method of sort of taking a person's arguments apart bit by bit. Plato then uses Socrates in the Republic, probably his most significant work, to describe the perfect city. And it is a city that has what he calls philosopher kings ruling the city. And philosopher kings are people who were taken from their family, raised in an intensive environment, um, a special camp where they are trained in athletics and philosophy and ethics and this kind of a thing. And the best then of that group then is the one that is chosen to lead the city. And because they have dedicated their lives to philosophy, they will then rule correctly rather than imposing self-interest in the act of governance. They will take into consideration the needs of all of the citizens, right? And it is the closest that in Plato's estimation we could come to in creating a perfect city, right? Socrates was a little bit more concerned in creating the perfect individual. Plato, on the other hand, criticizes Socrates in saying that is it possible to truly be a truly moral individual in an immoral society? Must we first be concerned with creating that perfect city so that all individuals then can pursue excellence without having to face the the opposition of others who are pursuing their own self-interest. Plato also developed something called the theory of ideas, which is forms or shapes that exist in a perfect form in some sort of, in the cloud, if you will, right? Later Christians will take Plato to mean that they are in the mind of God. And so you'll have a form of Platonism that is tied to Christianity. But he is trying to explain how it is that, we can see a man and have a concept of man and understand that there are many men. And many men represent variations of what? And what he's saying is, for us to be able to say that this is a man, I must first have a concept somewhere in my mind of a perfect image of a man, and realizing that any one individual is an imitation of that perfection and falls short of that perfection, right? But the theory of ideas say that there are perfect models somewhere out there, abstract concepts and material objects in a perfect form that exist, that are floating out there in the ethos, right? With imperfect copies in the real world. Aristotle, who is the third figure here, is Plato's pupil and had also attended classes with Socrates as well, is much closer to modern science than Plato is. although Plato may be more important to philosophy in the modern world than Aristotle is. Aristotle was for the Middle Ages going forward the very embodiment, the epitome of true knowledge, true understanding. Um, Dante Alighieri, the author of the Divine Comedy, will refer to Aristotle as the best of those who know, el meglio de color que sano, right? In the Divine Comedy, in the Inferno, they are sitting on the outskirts of heaven itself, because they weren't baptized, and so they cannot get into heaven. But Dante sees him there, and that reflects sort of the respect that Aristotle had, and he will continue to have that respect until 1500, 1600, and indeed people like Galileo, when they begin to develop their modern physics, have to sort of show how their physics is superior to what Aristotle had formulated. And this is, say, almost 1800 years after his death. He was still the leading authority in a whole host of different things. But his idea of understanding of the world came from that it should come from observation of real world events. He went out and he collected chicken eggs to show how chicken eggs, as they got older, would then develop a chicken inside them, right? So the observation of real world events, recording and comparing these events, applying reason to our analysis, and sort of in a variety of fields, in political analysis and in analysis of the worlds, he was sort of like a much broader vision of human knowledge and the way that human reason could sort of achieve it. Both Plato and Aristotle saw the polis, where we get the word political from, and the polis was the term for the sort of the core of the city-state, that way of life in the Greek city-state. Both Plato and Aristotle saw it as the ideal institution in which individuals could achieve excellence. Okay, we're going to cut this off here. It's gotten a little bit longer than I'd like. Thank you for putting up with me again. Good night.